Now we are entering, after we have set the scene, the context of the global and European energy picture, we're moving now on the EU energy policy. So that's the EU-centric view, how the EU, looks at itself and how the EU looks at other countries. But that last part, how the EU looks at other countries, we make after the break in the final session. Now, obviously, this is my interpretation of how the EU looks at itself. But of course, you know this. It is important to understand the foundations of European energy policy. There is no speech from the European Commission or from ministers which does not mention that the European Union was based on energy, which is true. There was a sectoral treaty on coal and steel community, which is the origin, the historical origin of the EU, and then there was one in '57 on atomic energy. But one should also add that beyond that, there was not a lot, or certainly nothing directly in the EU treaty about energy. The Spark report, which is the preparatory report for the Rome Treaty, which then led to the creation of the European Economic Community, suggested to include energy as a competence in the treaty, but that was rejected in the end by member states. In Maastricht, 1992, the question was brought up again, and member states said, yes, energy is very important, but not important enough to be in the treaty. There was some strange reference to it in Amsterdam, which looked at the treaty again. It was not even discussed. The same in Nice. But then in 2009, in Lisbon, finally, there is an energy chapter that has entered the EU treaty. And I'll come to that in a second. Now, still, there has been a lot of energy policy formulation, a lot of energy-related activities that matter in the EU. Lots of regulations, directives, decisions that relate to that. But they are not coming out of an EU energy policy competence. They rather come out of other competences that are in the EU treaty, EC treaties, that have a big impact, or that have an impact on energy. So here we have the initial phase, coal and steel and nuclear. I have covered that. I'm not going to go more into this. But then the energy really became more and more important with the internal market, which started to kick off in 1986 with the Single European Act. And there you had impact on the energy sector through technical harmonization, through public procurement, which is public purchasing, with governments buying power plants or companies buying power plants. And as you know, by now, each public purchase has to be tendered European-wide. So suddenly, countries could not just ask their national public procurement company to submit it, but it had to be tendered Europe-wide, so you had some opening. And then, starting gradually with 1988, there was a gradual opening of the electricity and gas market. There was also a Europeanization of research around the framework programs, as you all know, and then environment, renewables, policies by member states at EU level, of course, also have an impact on energy policy, as we know. Now, then, as an important element, a follow of the internal market, of course, European competition policy became more and more important, and the energy sector was also subject to more and more cases. So the energy sector was also opened up a lot by European competition policy. And if you go through the history, you have lots of cases dealing with energy. And if you really have time, at some read them through. It's quite instructive how difficult it is to open up the energy sector. In the Maastricht Treaty, then there was a gradual realization, if you want to have cross-border trade of electricity, of anything, you also need infrastructure. Because it doesn't make any sense if one pipeline stops at the border of Germany and doesn't go over to the next border. So you need a more pan-European infrastructure, and that was recognized in the Trans-European Networks, in 10, as we call, which basically focuses on missing links. That roads, railways, connections are brought together so that our infrastructure doesn't stop from one country to another. There was a first reference to consumer protection, very important in energy, that there are certain levels of consumer protection in different countries once the companies go across the borders and so on. There was some reference through external relations, and as I said, there was a sort of a small reference, which I call legal foot in the door. It was just one small reference, which didn't have a lot of practical meaning. Now, in the Lisbon Treaty, then finally, we have our energy chapter, and again, it is just repeating, in a way, if you wish, what has happened already on the ground over the years. Energy market regulation, energy market integration and regulation. There is a reference to security of supply, efficiency and renewables, long been going on, infrastructure going on since Maastricht Treaty at the latest, and then external relations again, but the difference is now that there's a legal competence. There's a legal competence, and measures under energy falls under the ordinary procedure. Now, here we have this in short. I make the slides available so you can go through that in peace. Now, function of energy market, of course, that's the core. Security of supply, yes, has to be in there. Efficiency, renewables, infrastructure. These are all the areas you would expect that have been there before. Interesting part is now there is a clause of solidarity in case of supply disruptions, what is going to happen. But keep in mind, and that's in a way an anomaly in comparison to member states, to policies in other countries, energy policies outside the EU, the energy mix, how much nuclear, how much renewables, in the end, is the responsibility of member states. Now, of course, that does not hold member states back from deciding by consensus that we all agree to have so much renewables, that we all agree on this, but each member state has a veto, holds a veto if it comes to certain things. Why is that? The first reason is member states want to make most of their domestic resources, and they don't want to have Brussels, as it is, to tell them what to do. But the real most fundamental reason is really that there's a deep split about nuclear. We all know this. Some countries don't accept it at all, some moving out, others want to promote it. So here, the member states that don't like nuclear don't want to be seen of having been forced to support nuclear, and those who have it don't want to risk that the others force them out. So the nuclear split really undermines a more comprehensive European energy policy. Here we have the treaty. I leave that for you. Now that's, I think, a very fundamental point. If you look at our EU energy policy, which we know just entered formally 2009, most of it is actually built around the market, the European energy market. And all this bluish stuff, I would say, has been linked somehow to the energy market. Internal market, public procurement, technical harmonization, some element of tax harmonization, competition policy, very big. Even the infrastructure element is built on the internal market. Even the solidarity, I can explain that in a second, is built on the internal market. Consumer protection is also related to that. Here, this is somewhat bluish, grayish, greenish, but still very much linked, not totally disconnected to the internal market, I would say. So their research is, if you wish, something a bit beyond that. Security of supply and external relations are less linked to the energy market. So keep that in mind, that most of the EU energy policy is really centered on this market historically, and this is also why the European Commission, has a strong reference to that, which is run, or at least policed by the European Commission, the market, while all the other parts is somewhat weaker and is subject to more bilateral member states' activities. Now, that will of course explain why the EU external energy policy is basically extension of the internal market to the rest of the world. And that is very clearly the competence of the Commission, and that is why this is always the first part that comes to the discussion. But we come that in the next session. So now if you want to see the EU energy policy as it is, you have this case that member states are free to choose about their energy mix. But, of course, they are within the context of the EU, competition policy, internal market rules, and all other regulatory framework applies. So member states are not entirely free. For example, member states cannot, at least in theory, subsidize nuclear if the EU doesn't agree with it. They cannot subsidize renewables if the EU agrees, but the EU has agreed that subsidies for renewables are acceptable. So there are constraints, but this depends then on the individual situation. And in addition, our Article 194 brings in added value for the EU in terms of infrastructure, in terms of environment, renewables, efficiency, solidarity, and so on. So, energy mix with member states within the context of the EU policies and internal market policies in particular. And then there is some added value by the Article 194 EU, allowing the EU to pursue more integrated policies. Now, therefore, keep in mind, EU energy policy is always internal market, or you cannot have EU energy policy without the internal market. So the two, in a way, tend to merge, sometimes blur how you wish it. Now, why is that? Historically, I have explained that, but I think what does it mean is really the more interesting part. Because the argument that this internal market is a good idea is not just because historically it has grown. Sometimes you have to ask whether we are on the right track. But the argument here about the internal market, the benefit of the internal market for the EU is really about security of supply. There is a bigger market which is more diverse. Typically you have wind in the north, solar in the south, gas from the east, south, some from the west, LNG, and then you have in some parts coal, Poland, and so on and so on. So you have a much more diverse, which means flexible market, which means more resilient. And let me just show you, just imagine if you do an energy security of supply policy for Bulgaria, it would probably be much more complicated, much more expensive than if you say, hey, let's integrate the Bulgarian market into the EU, because eventually, if the infrastructure allows, we might be able to bring that gas to Bulgaria and that gas and that gas. So basically, as long as the gas goes all around, then of course, we all benefit from the same level of security of supply. You might recall that some time ago there was a big controversy about the Nord Stream. The Baltic countries and Poland said, hey, we are disconnected, this is not acceptable because now you are circumventers. Germany makes this deal with Russia, déjà vu history. Now, in that logic of an internal market, that argument doesn't hold. Now, because once the gas is in Europe, it is, and that's the mandate, whether physically this is possible is another story, but once the gas is in Europe, in the EU, of course it's available to everybody. It's just not that one country then just withholds this and say, hey, by the way, this is our gas. No, of course, it is traded across the EU. Now, precondition is, of course, that we have infrastructure. And that was the major point in the 2008 gas crisis. We could not ship the gas from the west to the east. By now, this is more or less resolved, or at least the situation has radically improved. You recall in 2012, winter, there was a gas supply shortage, pressure went down, so gas actually moved from the east to the west, to France, and the infrastructure allowed that. So if there's a shortage somewhere and there are mechanisms to deal with that, then the gas can go somewhere else where it's needed. Of course, it is more expensive and normally there's a higher price related to that, but the structure based on the market, you know, is working. Now, whether it's really sufficiently working is another question. Whether it works in case of a very big supply disruption is another story. But in principle, for some level of supply disruption, that system has, at least according to the European Commission, worked. Now, there are more arguments in favor of the internal market, and here you see them. They are related to efficiency. You know, competition, we believe, increases the efficiency, leads to cost reduction, it leads to more innovation, and, you know, yeah, let's face it, it's in the treaty, and if it's in the treaty, there is a case to actually implement the measures. But there are a lot of arguments that this market is a basis for security of supply. Now, that is, of course, standard economics. This is not rocket science, but I wanted to show here that this is the philosophy of the EU in terms of security of supply. Now, part of that internal market has been the internal market for gas and electricity, and you all know that was based on unbundling of production, generation, transmission, and, if you wish, distribution, third-party access to networks. That means everybody can use the networks under certain non-discriminatory rules. Customers should be free to choose supply, interconnections, ensure the cross-border supply and cross-border competition, very important. And then there is national regulatory survey with some European oversight and increasingly more European survey. Now, we all know this is the theory. In practice, there's lots of questions. The EU is struggling since 20 years with creating this internal market, but we can have this on the discussions later on. But I'm trying to stylize here the EU energy policy discussion in the shortage of this, in the shortness of these presentations. We cannot go into all the complications. It's much easier in theory as a PowerPoint than to actually implement it in practice, but I think you are all aware of this. Here, that is more for later. I have tried to describe the different elements of this of the supply chain and what are the different operators do. But I skipped that. I just, you know, will provide it as a background document. Now, there are some elements of effects on market liberalization. Here are some pictures. The prices have gone down initially, which you would expect in all of these markets because there's a lot of slack because of excess capacity. Yes, prices go down, but that can last a number of years. The interesting part is then how it develops in the future. And then also you have to see that, of course, the fuel prices matter as well. So the promise of the internal market is not that we have lower costs. That you cannot promise because the fuel prices are very important. The promise was just that we have a more efficient energy sector because of competition, and that would normally, if it's properly implemented, give you a lower, more choice and lower cost than otherwise you would have been. So you have to deal with the counterfactual, you know, what you compare the current situation with something which would be, but you really cannot really compare because this would be is not clear. Now, more recently, I show here a slide from Germany. Power prices that has gone up in Germany, but in other countries as well, and that's partly to do with the costs of renewables, or it has largely to do with the cost of renewables and additional infrastructure to be put put in place. Now, the internal market communication by the European Commission tells us about the achievements. You see them here. There is choice and flexibility for consumers, competition, yes and no, you know, with a bit of a question mark. There is more transparency, liquidity, security of supply, and there is also an external part, the transparency with third countries. But a lot is still to be achieved. There is also issues with it, the internal market. Now, let me now briefly go a few minutes to recent EU energy policy developments. And I think the most important is really the 2008 climate and energy package, where the EU agreed on 20% greenhouse gas emissions reductions compared to 1990. You all know this. 20% better energy efficiency and 20% renewables, referred to as the 20-20-20 package, and I probably have heard it many, many times, so I don't want to go too much into detail. But it also has a number of other interesting elements, which meant a review of the European emissions trading system, binding target for car fleets, very, very important, EU greenhouse gas emissions from passenger cars and light vans will stabilize in the future, despite some increase in growth and driven kilometers because of the better efficiency. So that has a very big impact on oil imports. Then there is discussion about the framework for carbon capture and storage, state aid guidelines, and the strategic energy technology plan. And there's many, many more issues, but I just wanted to put them all up as one here. That, of course, is done in the context of the decarbonization of the European Union objective. And that is a slide which is from the European Commission website, linked to the low carbon roadmap. And it shows here the objective, the political objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. And that where we would be under current policy and what is still to be done with new policies. So expect many new policies. And important here is that after 2020, it's really, or after right now more or less, the decarbonization of the power sector should is the most important element. And that brings us back to these questions about renewables. There is a forcing of new renewables into the market. Now, of course, if you force renewables into the market, that is not entirely compatible with the EU internal market, but there is two conflicting policy objectives, if you wish. And now the question is to make these potentially conflicting policy objectives compatible. How can you bring the renewables into the market by not undermining the market? Things are happening also in other countries. I've just shown here the package, which I think is important to understand how it works. The EU is split, the EU economy is split into two. You have the power industry and possibly aviation and possibly maritime, although less likely, is one sector which has a total ceiling, has an absolute ceiling of emissions it can emit, and that is the European emissions trading system. This is a very centralized policy managed in Brussels, and then you have all the rest of the economy, 50 to 60%, buildings, transport, and so on and so on. That is done by member states, but also they have agreed absolute reduction targets. So therefore, that is member states' policies are put into place to achieve these targets, but they're also legally binding. In the middle, you have a number of policies that affect both parts, so that you have interactions. Here I show you the targets. We should not go too much into this. Now, this climate energy package, is not just about climate change, and it is also about security of supply, long term, not immediate, but in the longer term. The competitiveness of European industry, not in the short time, again, making the European industry fit for the low carbon age whenever it comes. And then, of course, promoting environmental sustainability and combating climate change. And you may have heard about the Europe 2020 strategy, which is the mission statement of the current European Commission, the Barroso II Commission, as we call it. And that means more or less, transform Europe into a highly energy efficient, low greenhouse gas emitting economy, resource efficient, and all these kind of things. So that's the longer term perspective. Now I suggest we finish here. There is a number of other policy initiatives that matter. There has been the gas regulation and so on and so on. But I suggest we take them in the questions and answers. If you have any questions on EU, maybe also on the previous section where we have set the context. So I leave this here, the EU's mission statement. Maybe this is a very good background for our discussion. It sort of summarizes the overall strategy as it is. And of course, as always, we all know this, the devil is then in the detail and in the implementation. And that is no way different from the EU, which is an equally complicated animal than any other member states or any other countries on this globe. Here we are coming to, I would almost have said, the final stretch in our short run. EU external energy policy. I receive a lot of invitation to speak about EU external policy, so I keep scratching my head. What am I going to say? So I try to structure a bit and then to lead us into discussions also linked to the discussions here in this country. When you look at the EU external energy policy, is like everything on the EU. There is a complicated framework that is not much different from other countries. I've been to some countries, and usually the internal politics are very complicated. Now, so I'm trying to explain also, based on the previous presentations, what the EU external energy policy actually can do, is supposed to do, and what it is not supposed to do. Keep in mind, sort of the backbone of the EU energy policy is the market. The market is our, catch-all, is the most important tool. So that, of course, has implications for the EU energy policy. So the questions, when I'm scratching my head, is always, who does what? And, we are speaking with a common voice. If we did, fine. But then who speaks? That's the first question. Because there are, of course, there are differences when you talk about the internal energy market. Then you have a good chance that you meet the European Commission. If you talk about solidarity, I guess you have a number of member states in the room who have something to say about this. Security of supply as well. Climate change, you have both the member states and the Commission. And of course, overall, the EU tries to support multilateral solutions. So this, in a way, gives us a little bit the framework. Let me stay a little bit on the climate change. Here, the EU, who speaks for whom and when, is also complicated, but it's fairly easygoing, because there's consensus about what the objectives are. There is a long tradition of member states cooperating, so there is, a relative high level of trust between the member states, so the things go easy when the EU operates in international fora. You don't see that one minister in one country, member state, says this is our policy, and the next day the next minister says something else. It just does not happen in climate change. Why? Because there's consensus. On energy, domestically, there's much less consensus, and that has to do with preferences for fuels, that has to do with history, that has to do with geography, that has to do with wealth, and so on, and so on. Now, although I should just make a little caveat, more recently, the EU unity on climate change has been less pronounced, because also you see differences in positions because of different levels of wealth, of welfare, and so on. So, who does then what? That is always the big question. Now, let me just try to give a little bit of structure, very simple structure to kick off the discussions. And these are based on the Energy 2020 strategy, which is sort of a general, very high-level document which outlines the priorities for EU energy policy, also external. And not surprisingly, what we have heard, the Energy Community Treaty is the first thing to mention. We are expanding the internal energy market to neighboring countries, and therefore we bring them into a more diverse, robust and resilient internal market. So we have some issues, and the tool, you know, the energy community, and we can take that up in discussion. In a way, to make this internal market work, the Commission also started, and the member states have agreed that the Commission starts to look into the intergovernmental agreements between the member states and the countries from which the gas is imported. For example, France and Russia, Italy and Russia. Now, these are the intergovernmental agreements which embed them. We are not talking about the EU looking into commercial agreements. You know, there are two different things. The company makes, Gaz de France, Suez, makes an agreement with Gazprom, which is a commercial, private contract, but that's embedded in a broader intergovernmental agreement. Now, the lines are sometimes blurred between the two, but these broader intergovernmental agreements now become more and more transparent, subject to scrutiny, at least according to the strategy. There was an idea about group supply agreements and network corridors. You know, it's really about more than network corridors. You call it the Southern Corridor, or if you want to Nabucco, these kind of things. And then I think there's probably a lot of technical assistance for energy system modernization happening also in this country. There is, you know, to bring up the energy sector technically to a higher level. So that is sort of the Europeanization, turning the European model, if you wish, to the outside and trying to convince third countries that this is a good way of going forward. Then, obviously, we are not just talking about in energy about Europe. We are talking about OPEC, other gas, other oil exporting countries. So there is an idea of privileged partnerships with key partners. The logic has been the EU-Russia energy dialogue. We share a continent, and there's a lot of gas in one part and a lot of consumption in the other. So can we come up with a partnership? And here, again, you see the language of Europeanization. We want this partnership, you know, and it should be based on market transparency and so on and so on. Mentioning of the Energy Charter Treaty, you could of course also mention energy community, but the energy community does not really cut any ice with supplier countries. Then you see third, the role for EU low carbon energy, and here you see more focus on energy efficiency than on low carbon, because the demand in many of the other countries is more about being more efficient, using energy more efficiently, than rather shifting to low carbon, which is nuclear, where the EU has no position on. Member states have, but not the EU, or expensive renewables, which is not really what countries, all countries that are developing, ask for. Of a rather important but somewhat outlier is sustainable energy initiatives with Africa, but that's part of development policy. There is a lot of support for efficiency and renewables in Africa and other developing countries. And maybe for me the most important would be a legally binding nuclear safety, security and non-proliferation standards. Now, that is very important objective, but also very important, very difficult objective. And possibly we might be too late in achieving this, but this is just my guess. So here you see the objectives, European external dimension of the European energy market, Europeanization. You see in the privileged partnerships with key partners also a fair deal of Europeanization. And even in the third, I would say, there is a fair degree of Europeanization, the low carbon, this climate and energy package put outside. And then 4 is really less of a Europeanization, that's more a global agenda. An important point, not so much of in immediate relevance, but in the longer term relevance, is the 4 February European Council, the first council which dealt with, the European Council that dealt with energy. And that was basically a first step where member states, where the EU starts a process to align the member states' external energy policies with EU objectives. Now that is a long-term process. Don't expect this is going to happening soon, but it's the first step. I think there was a qualitative change that the member states accepted that the EU starts looking into their international agreement. So far, member states have always said no, but now they have said yes, you know, maybe it's not such a bad idea at all. Let's look into this because that may have very big implications for our external energy policy unless we somehow create some more transparency there. So that was these discussions, and that, you know, however, as this evolves and as it emerges, that might or will, if it emerges properly, become an important element of the long-term better alignment of the EU external strategy with member states' priorities. So you see some convergence, you would see some convergence there. So, summing this a bit more up, the themes of EU external energy policy are, on the one hand, some multilateral. You see the external dimension of the EU market, energy community treaty, international agreements, technical assistance, and so on, but also the international institution building, the European, the Energy Charter Treaty, WTO, post-Kyoto framework, Rio+20, and so on and so on. You know this, and then our non-proliferations I mentioned. At the same time, we have a lot of bilateral. That means EU with China, EU with Russia, EU potentially with Ukraine. Ukraine is currently in the multilateral. So this privileged partnership with Russia, Mediterranean, yes, that should be actually more multilateral, but there is an element of both. Then green, the Gulf Cooperation Council, OPEC, India, China, you know, you name it, all the big players that have either a big role as a supplier or a big role as a consumer, or maybe both, some of them. So there's some bilateral because the EU has in its DA, we deal with the others in a multilateral framework, but some countries have in their DNA that they don't want to deal in the multilateral framework. So you have to accept this. And then the bilateral is also the low carbon, the climate change issue is also more and more at the same time moving into the bilateral agreements. There's no summit between the EU and someone without energy efficiency and climate change being on the agenda. So a lot of bilateral initiatives push that agenda forward. So it's not mutually exclusive. You have multilateral approaches and bilateral. So our international energy cooperation then is sort of dialogues and partnerships. This is basically starting from the neighbors of the neighbors and the rest of the world. For the neighbors, it's more the institution building. and obviously Ukraine is a neighbor. Energy community, the Energy Charter Treaty, while this is international, is institution building, but still it's not so much for the neighbors. It's more the neighbors of the neighbors, but this is, includes both. And here I've just put some of them down. So dialogues and partnerships, but the default option would always be the institution building if it's possible, and that includes the Europeanization, or if it's possible, then you have still possibility for partnerships and dialogue. Here I show you the different countries that are associated in the multilateral part, energy community parties, and so on. So it stretches to a lot within European neighborhood policies here. There has been some attempts, you may have seen that, about creating a kind of enhanced cooperation on energy, because some countries have said we want a more unified energy policy, and others have said we don't want it. So people thought about moving to a more enhanced cooperation or a Schengen approach, meaning some countries started and then it increases over time. I think personally these attempts will still fail because of a lack of agreement on nuclear, for example. Again, those countries who don't want to have nuclear in it would not want to join it, and those who want nuclear will also not want to join it unless there is a fully fledged competence. So I'm not so sure whether we actually get further with that approach, but it's certainly worthwhile looking into this. Now, of course, pipeline politics, Nord Stream, Southern Corridor, Nabucco, South Stream, whatever, plays a role and has been occupation for many, many years. But I think in a way we have, the things are changing. The Nord Stream is there. The South Stream is opening up. So from the supply perspective, Europe is gradually getting in a more comfortable situation. And maybe I put some provocative statement here. We're depending less on Ukrainian transit than we did before. And also from the Russian export potential, of course, that holds true as well. So that, I think, is an important element of it. I'm not so sure what it means here for this country. But let me also look quickly at the transit issue, which is now history. In a way, I understand there has been improvements. I would consider this as a mixture, as it always is, of a commercial and a political dispute. You know, when there's a political dispute, there's also commerce in it. There are solutions possible, you know, we know, but they come at a price. And it's, I think the EU has spelled it out. They come at the price in Ukraine, possibly also at Europe, but I would see the price probably more in the Ukraine. And now what has happened in the meantime, of course, there's alternative import and export routes, as I mentioned. So in that sense, the urgency is less strong than it used to be. But also we had put a more resilient internal market into place, which of course is an important part. So you see there's different gas coming from different parts of the world, but we had this before. And after all, Europe is still surrounded by a lot of potential gas sources. Now, let's just make a brutal cut here. You know, the world is not stopping, or the continent doesn't stop here just at the east. There is other parts of the world which are also important for the European external energy policy. You may have heard about Desertec and MedGrid. These are projects where you would bring concentrated solar power from Northern Africa to the EU. Now, I'm personally not too convinced that this will happen anytime soon. But of course, there is, what the message would be for me is, there are new other sources, alternative sources of supply possible, not necessarily in the concept of Desertec or Medgrid, but in principle, of course, there are renewable sources around Europe that might over time be brought in the EU. And if you look at this decarbonization agenda where the CO2 should be reduced, there is a case to be made for that. So I just want to say, yes, hydrocarbons are important. Until 2030 they are crucial, but they may be diminishing in terms of importance. They may. Also, we have alternative supply routes, so the urgency for the EU on this gas issue is less important. And there may be new areas, not necessarily Desertec and Medgrid. They could be, but there are other areas of supply that could play a role. And I think, just to finish with this, all these big geopolitical questions and these big energy economic questions which we discussed in the beginning in the context also are increasingly being influenced by international climate change policy developments which are ongoing despite the absence of an international agreement. We are not on track to meet any of the targets related to 2 degrees, but emissions are reduced almost everywhere. And a lot of countries have taken on unilateral commitments under the Copenhagen Accord. So many countries have accepted to do something about it. So don't underestimate this important. Sustainable development in the emerging economies, the developing world, becomes more and more important. And green growth, green jobs, as a diffuse concept yet, also plays increasingly a role. So, yes, hydrocarbons are important, but there is other emerging or parallel or merging agendas coming onto this, which I think are important also to be kept in mind, even if they may not be as important for the current discussion we're having here. I would like to finish here and, thank you for your attention and, joining us today for this discussion. So, thank you.